The Mexican Church's best-kept secret has just been revealed. Pope Leo XIV holds in his hands the evidence linking former Archbishop Rivera to the cover-up of unforgivable crimes. Can faith survive its own truth? The final judgment has begun. After serious allegations suppressed for years, Pope Leo orders an investigation against former Archbishop Norberto Rivera, and the Vatican trembles. It was a grey dawn in Rome, one of those dawns when the sky seems like a leaden shroud refusing to let the light through. Robert Francis Provost, now known to the entire world as Pope Leo XIV, stood before the window of his apartments in the Apostolic Palace. His fingers, which had caressed the dry earth of Chiclayo, the old wooden altars in Peru, now bore the weight of a gold ring that felt like a shackle. Less than a year had passed since that May 8, 2025, when the white smoke announced his name, and yet he felt as if he had aged a century. The calendar on his desk read March 31st, 2026. An ordinary Tuesday for the world, but a day of judgment for the memory of an institution he had sworn to cleanse. On the oak table rested a purple folder, the color of mourning and penance. Inside, the name Norberto Rivera Carrera gleamed with the coldness of a sentence. Leo XIV closed his eyes and could almost smell the stale incense of Mexican sacristies. For more than 2 decades, Rivera was not only the Archbishop of Mexico City, he was a bulwark, a man whose political and economic influence wove a web that not even the Atlantic Ocean could unravel. The Pope recalled his own years as a missionary in Peru in the 1980s and 1990s. While he was trying to understand the misery of the impoverished neighborhoods, Rivera was consolidating an empire of silence in the north. The rumor wasn't new. It was an echo that had been bouncing off the marble walls of the Curia for years. But rumors in the Vatican are like gas, invisible until someone lights a match. And Leo XIV was holding the match. The first part of the investigation focused on a ghost that refused to rest, Father Nicolas Aguilar Rivera. Leo XIV ran his hand over the typed pages, feeling the relief of the ink. The accusations of child abuse in Mexico and the United States were a cry stifled by parish transfers and documents that vanished into thin air. Rivera, according to the victims' testimonies now resting on the papal desk, had known everything. He had allowed the wolf to continue guarding the sheep, only in a different fold. Faith cannot be a shield against infamy, the pontiff whispered to himself. His voice sounded small in the vastness of the room, a room that seemed designed to remind whoever inhabited it that he was but a fleeting moment in the annals of eternity. His mind drifted back to 2007, when a civil suit in the United States attempted to drag Rivera into court. The case was dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. There was no conviction, but Leo XIV knew from his training in canon law at the University of St. Thomas Aquinas that the absence of a civil sentence did not mean the absence of sin or crime before God. That detail was the heart of his agony. Rivera was never definitively judged on the facts. He shielded himself behind the border, behind bureaucracy, behind the sovereignty of a church that sometimes confused mercy with cover-up. The Pope felt a chill. He knew that investigating Rivera was not just investigating a man. It was dismantling a system of mutual protection that included high-level businessmen and politicians of the old Mexican guard. Rivera was the bridge between the altar and secular power, a man who dined with presidents, while abuse reports piled up in the drawers of his chancery. "Your Holiness, the consultants are waiting," said a voice from the doorway. It was his secretary, pale-faced and his eyes avoiding him. Leo XIV did not respond immediately. He looked at his hands. These were the hands of a 70-year-old man, born in Chicago, who had studied mathematics at Villanova, and now had to solve the most difficult equation of his life: how to save the church from itself, without its foundations collapsing in the process. The tension in the Curia was palpable. He could feel it in the way the cardinals greeted him in the corridors with an icy courtesy that concealed knives behind their smiles. The reformers hoped for a miracle, the conservatives for a mistake, and at the center was Norberto Rivera Carrera, already retired, but still surrounded by a Praetorian guard of loyalties bought with past favors. The Pope took up the pen. His fingers trembled for a moment before regaining the firmness that had led him to be the prior general of the Augustinians for 12 years. He knew that the truth was a dangerous tool. Once unleashed, it cannot be locked away again, and he didn't. Unan recalled his own motto: "In the one, we are one, but what happens when a part of that body is rotten?" Saint Augustine, his spiritual guide, had always spoken of the church as a mixture of wheat and tares. Leo XIV felt that the tares were beginning to choke the grain. That morning, as the Roman sun finally managed to pierce the fog with anemic rays, the Pope signed the decree authorizing full access to the secret archives of the dicastery for bishops, the very one he had presided over before his election. He was seeking definitive proof of the cover-up. He was seeking the truth about the money that, according to persistent rumors, flowed from obscure sources into the church coffers under Rivera's command. The air in the office grew heavy. Leo XIV sat in his chair, the one once occupied by Francis, and felt the ghost of his predecessor watching him. Francis had left him a marked path, but Leo XIV would have to tread on the thorns that the Argentinian had failed to uproot. "May God forgive me if I'm wrong," he murmured, "but may he punish me if I remain silent." The process had begun. The first step in the downfall was underway. The investigation would not be merely an administrative formality. It would be a descent into the inferno of institutional complicity. Rivera, the man who had once been the face of faith in Mexico, was now in the crosshairs of a pope who feared neither numbers, nor shadows, nor the consequences of a final act of integrity. The atmosphere of the Vatican shifted that day. It wasn't a physical earthquake, but a change in the air pressure. The initial rumor was transforming into an administrative certainty. Pope Leo XIV, the Augustinian from Chicago, who loved tennis and justice, had just declared war on the righteous within his own house. The silence in the Vatican Apostolic Archives, the one that for centuries had been called secret, was not a silence of peace, but of suffocation. Robert Francis Provost, Pope Leo XIV, walked through the subterranean corridors, where the air was dry, heavy with the smell of acidified paper and the dust of unspoken truths. He carried a small flashlight. Despite the modern electric lighting, it was a habit from his missionary days, an instinctive distrust of the clarity offered to him officially. He stopped in front of the section dedicated to the nunciatures of Latin America. His eyes, weary after decades of scrutinizing legal texts and tormented souls, searched for the code corresponding to Mexico City. March 31st, 2026. Time was slipping through his fingers. He knew that outside, in St. Peter's Square, tourists were taking pictures, oblivious to the fact that beneath their feet, the Vicar of Christ was opening a tomb. He found the box. It wasn't large, but it felt as heavy as lead. Inside lay the files from 2007. Leo XIV took out a folder containing the transcripts of the civil lawsuit filed in Los Angeles against Norberto Rivera Carrera. His fingers traced the lines detailing the alleged protection of Father Nicolas Aguilar Rivera. The document was a dance of legal technicalities, a choreography designed to avoid the heart of the matter: lack of jurisdiction. That phrase was repeated like a mantra on the pages signed by the archdiocese's lawyers. Leo XIV clenched his jaw. In his mind, the mathematics of his youth in Villanova flashed. Denied jurisdiction plus institutional silence equals an open wound. It wasn't an absolution, it was an escape. He recalled the phrase he had included in his enthronement speech: "Justice delayed, it is justice denied." Back then, many cardinals had applauded with a hypocrisy that now, in the solitude of the archives, made him nauseous. He was looking for something in particular: holiness. The voice emerged from the shadows, sharp and precise. It was Cardinal Pietro Vigano, a man who personified the old guard, those who believed that the prestige of the church was more sacred than the safety of a child. His footsteps made no sound on the stone floor. "I seek memory, Cardinal," replied Leo XV without turning around. "It seems we have a chronic tendency towards selective amnesia in this palace." Vigano approached, his red musket casting a shadow that looked like a pool of blood in the dim light. "Norberto Rivera is a man who served the church in difficult times, Your Holiness. His influence was vital in maintaining political equilibrium in Mexico. Investigating him now is like trying to demolish a column that holds up the roof above our heads. If he falls, the profound impact on the faith of millions of Mexicans will be catastrophic." Leo XIV turned slowly. His usually gentle eyes shone with a cold determination. "If the roof rests on a column of lies, Cardinal, then it is my duty to let it fall. I prefer a church in ruins to a church built on the silence of the victims. You know what fear is, not the fear of God, but the fear of the truth. That is what I am addressing in this dossier." Vigano didn't blink, but a muscle in his cheek twitched. The confrontation wasn't just verbal. It was a clash of two worlds: the world of shadow diplomacy, against the world of transparency that Leo XIV was trying to forge. The Pope turned his attention back to the documents. There was something else, something not mentioned in the abuse allegations, but which appeared in handwritten marginal notes by an anonymous informant within the papal annunciation. They were numbers, accounts in tax havens, anonymous donations of astronomical proportions that coincided with the period of greatest violence in northern Mexico. The rumor of a connection to drug money ceased to be a sensationalist headline and became an internal line of investigation that no one had dared to pursue. Leo XIV closed the case. That night, after the corridors of the Apostolic Palace were plunged into darkness, the Pope couldn't sleep. He retreated to his private library, a space he preferred to the opulence of the official rooms. There, seated in a worn leather chair, he began to write in his personal diary. His handwriting was small, nervous. I feel like a man trying to stop a flood with his hands. Norberto is not just a man, he is a network. I have seen the names of the businessmen who financed his projects, men who appear on lists of the world's richest people and who are simultaneously received with honors at this holy see. How can we hold them accountable when we ourselves have accepted their gold? The Pope's vulnerability was real. He considered giving up. He thought that perhaps Viano was right, and that the truth would destroy what little credibility the institution had left. But then he remembered the face of a woman he had met in Chiclayo, a mother seeking justice for her disappeared son. She had no secret files or cardinals to protect her. She had only her faith. If I fail her, I fail him, Leo XV murmured, looking at the simple wooden crucifix hanging on his wall. The pressure was suffocating. He knew that Rivera had allies in the intelligence services, and that his communications were being monitored by internal factions of the Vatican gendarmerie, loyal to the old administration. Every step he took toward the truth was a step toward his own political vulnerability. Chapter 3 of his life as Pope was beginning to be written in the ink of confrontation. Rivera represented the kind of power that feels untouchable because it knows too much about others. But Leo XIV, the mathematician from Chicago, knew that every system, however complex, has a breaking point. His task was to find it. The investigation was no longer just a search for documents. It was transforming into a counterintelligence operation within the sacred walls. He had ordered his secretary, a young Polish priest he trusted implicitly, to contact certain investigative journalists in Mexico unofficially. He needed the pieces of the puzzle that weren't in the archives in Rome. The first-hand accounts, the money trails the former archbishop had laid beyond the reach of ecclesiastical audits. It was already pitch black when Leo XIV laid down his pen, his eyes burned. The fatigue wasn't just physical, it was an existential burden. He knew that at dawn on April 1st, the world would awaken to new leaks, to coordinated attacks on social media to discredit his pontificate. They would call him weak, they would call him a traitor to tradition. He got up and walked to the small chapel adjacent to his bedroom. He knelt on the cold carpet. He didn't ask for power or success. He asked for courage. The courage to be the first pope who dared to look in the eye the monster that the church had nurtured within its own bosom. Norberto Rivera Carrera, the man who was once the face of faith in modern Mexico, was now the symbol of everything Leo XIV was willing to sacrifice to save the soul of the institution. The battle for truth was ceasing to be a rumor and becoming a raging wildfire, and the Pope was at the heart of the flames, holding the only map that could lead them out. Integrity at any cost. The reign over the Vatican was not a blessing, but a reminder of the erosion. It was already night when Robert Francis Provost, Pope Leo XIV, stood on the terrace of the Apostolic Palace, letting the dampness soak into his white cassock. He didn't mind the cold. The cold was honest. Vatican politics were not. That March 31, 2026, felt like the pivotal moment of a century that refused to fully begin, trapped between the glories of the past and the sins that the present could no longer contain. In his right hand, out of sight of the Swiss guards, he held an encrypted mobile phone. He had received a message from a source in Mexico City. It wasn't a clergyman, but a former Mexican intelligence agent, who, now in the twilight of his life, was seeking redemption. The name Norberto Rivera Carrera appeared in the message, linked to a word that made the pontiff's stomach churn: interlocutor. Rivera wasn't just a shepherd of souls, he was an architect of realities. Leo XIV recalled his studies of Mexican history, the complex dance between the state and the church that had continued from the reform laws to the present day. Norberto had been the master of that dance. For more than 2 decades, his office in the Roma neighborhood received not only penitents, but also owners of television empires, union leaders, and figures who determined the fate of the Mexican peso. The Pope sighed. The smoke from his breath mingled with the Roman fog. He knew that Rivera's influence was a web of debt. If a politician needed the support of conservative sectors, Rivera was there. If a businessman needed a public blessing to cleanse a reputation tarnished by tax audits, Rivera would celebrate mass. That symbiosis had created a seemingly impenetrable shield. "How far does privilege extend, sir?" Leo XIV asked the darkness. He returned to his chambers. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the flickering light of a desk lamp. On the table lay a map of Mexico marked in red. These weren't dioceses. They were zones of influence where drug money had infiltrated parish structures under the guise of anonymous donations for church restoration. The rumor linking church figures to cartel money flows wasn't a fabrication of the press. It was a festering wound no one had dared to clean. The Pope sat down and opened his diary. His fingers, which had once proudly touched his canon law thesis in 1987, now scribbled notes on the ethics of power. "I have discovered that protecting Nicolas Aguilar wasn't just a moral failing, it was a favor paid for. Aguilar had connections with powerful families that Rivera needed for his own church infrastructure projects. The church became a bargaining chip. How can I preach about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the challenges of artificial intelligence if we haven't resolved the barbarity of 20th century complicity?" A soft knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. It was his personal secretary, Father Marek. He was carrying an envelope bearing the seal of the Secretariat of State. "Your Holiness, a note has arrived from the Mexican embassy. It is of a private nature." Leo XIV broke the seal. The letter, written in exquisite diplomatic language but laced with venom, suggested that certain investigations could jeopardize the educational and social cooperation treaties between the two states. It was a threat wrapped in tissue paper. The Mexican government, or at least certain sectors that still owed Rivera favors, didn't want the Vatican stirring up trouble. The Pope felt a pang of fear. It wasn't the fear of death, but the fear of failure. He considered for a moment the possibility of the easy way out: a 10-year study commission, an ambiguous statement, administrative silence. Rivera was already an elderly, retired man. He could let biology do the work that justice was avoiding. He stood up and walked to an antique gilded-framed mirror. He saw himself, not the sovereign of Vatican City. He saw Robert, the kid from Chicago who grew up in Dalton. The man who became a naturalized Peruvian because he loved a people who had no voice. He saw the fragility of his own skin. "If I back down now, I'm not just betraying the victims," he told himself in a dry whisper. "I'm betraying the man I was before I put on this cassock." That same night he made a decisive decision. He wouldn't send an official apostolic visitor. He would use his own network. He remembered his time as Prior General of the Augustinian Order. He had friars in every corner of the world, men who owed him obedience, and who, unlike the Curia, weren't tainted by the ambition for a cardinal's hat. He called Father Alejandro, an Augustinian who worked in the outskirts of Nezahualcóyotl. The connection was unstable. The sound came with a metallic echo. "Alejandro, it's Robert. I need you to find the families in the Aguilar case. I don't want official reports. I want recordings. I want to know what they were offered to keep quiet in 2007. And I want the names of the businessmen who were in the front row at Rivera's last mass before his retirement." "Your Holiness, that's dangerous," replied the voice from the other side of the world. "Here, the air has ears. The Holy Spirit too. Alexander, do it for the Church, not for me." As Leo XIV hung up, he felt the weight of betrayal hanging in the corridors. He knew that Vigano and his followers would already be aware of his move. The Vatican is a place where the walls sweat secrets. The high pressure was warping the very structure of his pontificate. The secret documents, which were once just papers, were now loaded weapons. Humanizing his struggle meant acknowledging his own fallibility. That night, Leo XIV didn't pray like a pope. He prayed like a sinner, asking forgiveness for what he was about to destroy. Rivera was a symbol of the system. Bringing him down meant admitting that the Church had been, for decades, a high-class accomplice in the Mexican tragedy. His heart rate increased with every thought. The melancholic introspection of the afternoon had transformed into an iron determination. The truth was his only weapon, and he planned to use it at the next consistory. But first, he had to survive the shadows that already thick day. The net was closing in on him. In the dim light of his library, Pope Leo XV stared at the map of Mexico, knowing that his next step would not be a blessing, but a declaration of war against impunity. The third phase of his reign was stained with the invisible blood of political deals. Rivera, the man who spoke with God and with money, would soon discover that in Chicago, too, they knew how to play hardball. Leo XV turned off the lamp, letting the darkness of the palace envelop him, while in his mind, the mathematics of justice began to yield their first results. The night of March 31st, 2026, seemed endless. The air inside the Apostolic Palace felt stale, as if centuries of intrigue had consumed all the available oxygen. Robert Francis Prevost, Pope Leo X, sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by mountains of documents, detailing the moral erosion of one of the most important dioceses in the world. His eyes, reddened by the lack of sleep, the dim light of a reading lamp, brought them to a report from the Nunciature, dated August 2012. It was the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, a time when the world began to shout truths that the Church had tried to whisper in sealed confessionals. Leo XIV turned the page with almost ritualistic slowness. The report spoke of a pattern of transference, silence, repetition. The name of Norberto Rivera Carrera appeared in the margins, not as an executor, but as the great architect of oblivion. The Pope recalled how, while he administered the Diocese of Chiclayo, news of structural abuses in Ireland and Germany crossed the ocean like dark storm clouds. In Mexico, however, the sun of impunity seemed to shine with an unnatural force. Silence is not peace, it is complicity, Leo XIV murmured, his voice breaking in the solitude of the room. He got up to get some water. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor with a heavy cadence. He felt fallible, a man of flesh and blood, trapped in an armor of theological infallibility that offered him no protection against the evidence of administrative sin. Returning to his desk, he opened the folder, marked with the crimson seal of the Extraordinary Affairs section. This is where the narrative turned dangerous. This is where sacristy rumors morphed into lines of financial investigation. Chapter 5 of his private investigation dealt with gold that didn't come from God. Leo XIV read about audits that were never completed, about cash flows entering the archdiocese's coffers under the guise of extraordinary donations. The numbers were obscene, seven-figure sums appearing after religious festivals in areas controlled by major drug cartels. The rumor that Rivera Carrera had served as a conduit, or at least a silent witness, for money laundering by drug traffickers was an abyss few had dared to peer into. "It's possible we built cathedrals with the price of blood," he wrote in his diary, his handwriting betraying his anguish. "I've seen notes about meetings at private ranches outside of official schedules, names that match the targets of the US Drug Enforcement Administration. If this is true, Norberto didn't just cover for men, he covered up hell itself. The Pope's vulnerability was evident in his desire to be anywhere else. He thought of the simplicity of the Augustinians, of the rule of St. Augustine, which spoke of having one heart and one soul oriented toward God. How far this palace was from that ideal, Leo XIV felt like a prisoner of luxury, guarded by men who swore to die for him while leaking his doubts to the conservative press. A message appeared on his tablet screen. It was a social media notification.